The following outline is provided as an overview of and topical guide to New Zealand. New Zealand, sovereign island nation located in the West and South Pacific Ocean, comprising two large islands, the North Island and the South Island, and numerous smaller islands, most notably Stewart Island, Rakiura and the Chatham Islands. The indigenous Māori named New Zealand Aotearoa, which is commonly translated into English is the land of the long white cloud. The realm of New Zealand also includes the Cook Islands and Niue, which are self-governing but in free association, Tokelau, and the Ross Dependency. New Zealand is notable for its geographic isolation, situated about 2,000 kilometres southeast of Australia across the Tasman Sea, its closest neighbours to the north being New Caledonia, Fiji and Tonga. During its long isolation, New Zealand developed a distinctive fauna dominated by birds, many of which became extinct after the arrival of humans and the mammals they introduced. The population is mostly of European descent, with the indigenous Māori being the largest minority. Asians and non-Māori Polynesians are also significant minorities, especially in the cities. Elizabeth II, as the Queen of New Zealand, is the head of state and, in her absence, is represented by a non-partisan Governor-General. The Queen reigns but does not rule. She has no real political influence, and her position is essentially symbolic. Political power is held by the democratically elected Parliament of New Zealand under the leadership of the Prime Minister, who is the head of government. General reference. Pronunciation. Common English country name, New Zealand. Official English country name, New Zealand. Common endonym, New Zealand. Official endonym, New Zealand. Adjectival, New Zealand. Demonym, New Zealander, Kiwi. Etymology, name of New Zealand. International rankings of New Zealand. ISO country codes, NZ/NZAL 554. ISO region codes, see ISO 3166-2, NZ. Internet country code top-level domain, NZ. Geography of New Zealand. New Zealand is a group of islands, a country, an island country, a nation-state, a Commonwealth realm. Location: Southern Hemisphere and Eastern Hemisphere, Pacific Ocean, South Pacific Ocean, Oceania, Polynesia, Australasia. Time zone: Chatham Islands, Chatham Standard Time, Chatham Daylight Time. Rest of New Zealand, New Zealand Standard Time, New Zealand Daylight Time, September to April. Extreme points of New Zealand: North, Nugent Island; South, Jacmart Island; East, Kahuatara Point, Pitt Island; West, Cape Lovett, Auckland Island; High, Aoraki, Mount Cook 3,754 meters; Low, South Pacific Ocean 0 meters. Land boundaries: none. Coastline: South Pacific Ocean 15,134 kilometers. Population of New Zealand: 4,286,500. 122nd most populous country. Area of New Zealand: 268,680 square kilometers. Atlas of New Zealand. Environment of New Zealand. Climate of New Zealand. Climate change in New Zealand. Ecoregions in New Zealand. Environmental issues in New Zealand. Geology of New Zealand. Earthquakes in New Zealand. Volcanism of New Zealand. Protected areas of New Zealand. Biosphere reserves in New Zealand. National parks of New Zealand. Renewable energy in New Zealand. Wildlife of New Zealand. Flora of New Zealand. Fauna of New Zealand. Birds of New Zealand. Mammals of New Zealand. Natural geographic features of New Zealand. Fjords of New Zealand. Glaciers of New Zealand. Islands of New Zealand. Lakes of New Zealand. Mountains of New Zealand. Volcanoes in New Zealand. Rivers of New Zealand. Waterfalls of New Zealand. Valleys of New Zealand. World Heritage Sites in New Zealand. Regions of New Zealand, ecoregions of New Zealand, administrative divisions of New Zealand, provinces of New Zealand, territorial authorities of New Zealand, provinces of New Zealand, territorial authorities of New Zealand, municipalities of New Zealand, capital of New Zealand, Wellington, cities of New Zealand, demography of New Zealand, government and politics of New Zealand. Main article, Government of New Zealand and Politics of New Zealand, Form of government, Capital of New Zealand, Wellington, Elections in New Zealand, Political parties in New Zealand, Taxation in New Zealand, Types, Liberalism, Socialism, Christian, Far-right, Republicanism, Māori, Issues, Capital punishment, Civil unions, Electoral reform, Guns, Prostitution, Policies, Think big, Rogernomics, Euthanasia, Working for families. Branches of the Government of New Zealand, Executive branch of the Government of New Zealand, Head of State, Queen of New Zealand, Queen Elizabeth II. Head of Government, Prime Minister of New Zealand, John Key. New Zealand Cabinet, Legislative branch of the Government of New Zealand, Parliament of New Zealand, New Zealand House of Representatives, Judicial branch of the Government of New Zealand, Supreme Court of New Zealand, Foreign Relations of New Zealand, Diplomatic missions in New Zealand, Diplomatic missions of New Zealand, Australia-New Zealand relations. International Organization membership. New Zealand is a member of Law and Order in New Zealand, Capital punishment in New Zealand, Constitution of New Zealand, Crime in New Zealand, Human rights in New Zealand, LGBT rights in New Zealand, Freedom of religion in New Zealand, Law enforcement in New Zealand, Terrorism in New Zealand, Military of New Zealand, Commander-in-Chief, Ministry of Defence of New Zealand, Forces, Army of New Zealand, Navy of New Zealand, Air Force of New Zealand, Special Forces of New Zealand, Military history of New Zealand, Military ranks of New Zealand, Local government in New Zealand, History of New Zealand. Main article, History of New Zealand, Timeline of the history of New Zealand, and current events of New Zealand, Military history of New Zealand, Political history of New Zealand, Treaty of Waitangi-Waihi, Miners' Strike 1951, Waterfront Dispute 1981, Springbok Tour, Corn Gate Foreshore and Seabed Controversy, Ariwa Speech, Culture of New Zealand, Architecture of New Zealand, Cuisine of New Zealand, Festivals in New Zealand, Languages of New Zealand, New Zealand English, Maori language, New Zealand Sign Language, Media in New Zealand, Museums in New Zealand, National symbols of New Zealand, Coat of Arms of New Zealand, Flag of New Zealand, National Anthem of New Zealand, People of New Zealand, Public holidays in New Zealand, Records of New Zealand, Religion in New Zealand, Christianity in New Zealand, Hinduism in New Zealand, Islam in New Zealand, Judaism in New Zealand, Sikhism in New Zealand, World Heritage Sites in New Zealand, Art in New Zealand, Art of New Zealand, Cinema of New Zealand, Literature of New Zealand, Music of New Zealand, Television in New Zealand, Theatre in New Zealand, Sports in New Zealand, Rugby Union in New Zealand, Rugby League in New Zealand, Football in New Zealand, New Zealand at the Olympics, Stadiums in New Zealand, Horse tracks in New Zealand, Economy and infrastructure of New Zealand, Economic rank by nominal GDP, 51st. Agriculture in New Zealand, Banking in New Zealand, Reserve Bank of New Zealand, Communications in New Zealand, Internet in New Zealand, Telecommunications in New Zealand, Companies of New Zealand, Currency of New Zealand, Dollar ISO 4217 NZD. Energy in New Zealand, New Zealand Emissions Trading Scheme, Oil and gas industry in New Zealand, Healthcare in New Zealand, Hospitals in New Zealand, Mining in New Zealand, New Zealand Stock Exchange, tourism in New Zealand, transport in New Zealand, airports in New Zealand, rail transport in New Zealand, roads in New Zealand, water supply and sanitation in New Zealand, education in New Zealand.